The Mafia threatened Tony Bennett. Dean Martin's quiet move saved his life. The October wind carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and diesel exhaust through the narrow streets of Astoria, Queens, as Anthony Dominic Benedetto walked the familiar path home from the Triborough Bridge construction site. His work boots, caked with concrete dust and worn thin at the heels, echoed against the cracked sidewalk with the rhythm of exhaustion. The year was 1946, and at 20 years old, Tony had already lived through more than most men twice his age. The brownstone at 32nd Street stood like a tired sentinel against the grey sky, its red brick facade weathered by decades of New York winters. Tony paused at the front steps, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came with coming home. Inside, his mother Anna would be waiting, her weathered hands working over a pot of minestrone that would have to stretch for 3 days, her eyes holding that particular brand of worry that had settled there permanently since his father's death 10 years ago. "Tony, that you?" Her voice called from the kitchen as the front door creaked open. The smell of garlic and tomatoes, mixed with the lingering scent of his younger brother John's cigarettes, created an atmosphere that was both comforting and suffocating. "Yeah, Ma. Just me." Tony dropped his canvas work bag by the door and rolled his shoulders, feeling every one of the 10 hours he'd spent mixing cement and carrying steel beams. The construction job paid enough to keep food on the table and the rent current, but it was killing him slowly, one back-breaking day at a time. Anna Benedetto appeared in the doorway, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. At 48, she looked older, her dark hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with the kind of worry that came from raising 3 children alone in Depression-era Queens. But her eyes still held the fierce determination that had kept the family together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. "You look tired, figlio mio," she said, reaching up to touch his cheek with calloused fingers. "Too tired for a boy your age?" Tony managed a smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Ma. Just a long day." He glanced toward the kitchen, where the sound of bubbling soup created a soundtrack of home. "Smells good in there?" "Sit," she commanded, already moving back toward the stove. "Eat first, then we talk." The kitchen table, scarred from years of use and covered with a checkered oilcloth that had seen better days, became their conference room every evening. It was here that Tony had first told his mother about his plan to audition for amateur night at the local clubs. It was here that she had cried when he enlisted to serve in the war. And it was here, over countless bowls of whatever Anna could scrape together, that they had planned and replanned their survival strategy for the past decade. Tony sat heavily in the wooden chair, its familiar creaks welcoming him home. Anna placed a steaming bowl before him, the rich aroma of vegetables and beans rising like a prayer of gratitude. In the corner, the old Philco radio crackled with static as it picked up the evening news, the announcer's voice painting pictures of a world trying to rebuild itself after the devastation of war. "John got another rejection today," Anna said quietly, settling into her own chair with a cup of coffee that was more chicory than actual coffee beans. "From the music publisher on Tin Pan Alley. They said his songs were too sophisticated for what people want to hear now." Tony's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. His younger brother had been trying to break into the music business as a songwriter, spending his days crafting melodies and lyrics that captured the complexity of post-war America. But the music industry seemed to want nothing more than simple, cheerful tunes that helped people forget the darkness they had all lived through. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Tony said carefully. "Being too sophisticated, I mean." Anna's eyes sharpened. She knew that tone in her eldest son's voice, had heard it countless times when he was working up the courage to say something she wouldn't want to hear. "What are you thinking, Anthony?" He set down his spoon and looked at his mother across the narrow table. The kitchen light, a bare bulb hanging from a frayed cord, cast harsh shadows across both their faces, making them look older, more worn than they were. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood settling in for the evening created a familiar symphony. Children being called in for dinner, radios tuning into evening programs, the distant rumble of the elevated train carrying commuters home from Manhattan. "I've been thinking about the clubs again, Ma," he said, his voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in his stomach. The singing. Anna's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, worry, resignation, and finally, a kind of weary acceptance. She had known this conversation was coming, had seen it in the way Tony's eyes lit up whenever music played on the radio, in the way he hummed unconsciously while he worked, in the way he seemed to come alive only when he was performing at family gatherings or church functions. "The clubs don't pay enough to live on, Figlio," she said gently. "You know this. Not the small ones, no, but there are bigger places, better places, places where a singer can make real money." Tony leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his voice taking on the passionate edge that had always appeared when he talked about music. "I've been watching, listening. The war changed things. People want something different now, something real. They're tired of the manufactured happiness, the fake cheerfulness. They want to hear about what we've all been through." Anna sipped her coffee, studying her son's face over the rim of her cup. She had seen this determination before, had watched it carry him through the horrors of combat in Europe, had seen it sustain him through the grinding daily reality of construction work. But she had also seen where dreams could lead in their neighborhood, to disappointment, to poverty, to the kind of desperation that made men do things they never thought they would do. "And if it doesn't work?" she asked quietly. "If the clubs don't want what you're offering, if the audience doesn't understand what you're trying to say?" Tony was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around the warm ceramic of his soup bowl. Through the thin walls of the brownstone, he could hear Mrs. Kowalski's baby crying in the apartment next door, the sound mixing with the distant melody of someone practicing piano scales. These were the sounds of survival, of people doing what they had to do to get by in a world that offered few guarantees. "Then I'll come back to construction," he said finally. "But Ma, if I don't try now, if I don't at least see if there's something out there for me beyond mixing concrete and carrying steel, I think it'll kill me. Not quickly, but slowly, day by day, until there's nothing left of who I really am." Anna reached across the table and took his hands in hers. Her skin was rough from years of washing clothes and scrubbing floors, but her touch was gentle, full of the kind of love that had kept their family together through the darkest times. "You have your father's voice," she said quietly. "Not just the sound of it, but the way it carries truth. People listen when you sing, Anthony. They hear something in you that they recognize, something that speaks to their own experiences. Then you understand why I have to try." She nodded slowly, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I understand, but I also worry. The music business, it's not always kind to people like us. People who have principles, who won't compromise what they believe in for success." Tony squeezed his mother's hands gently. "I know, Ma, but I also know that if I don't stay true to who I am, to what I believe music should be, then success won't mean anything anyway." Outside, the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting pools of yellow light along the sidewalks where children played stickball and adults gathered to discuss the day's events. This was Tony's world, had been his world for 20 years. But as he sat in that familiar kitchen, holding his mother's work-worn hands, he felt something shifting inside him, a recognition that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The radio crackled, and suddenly the kitchen filled with the smooth, sophisticated sound of Frank Sinatra singing, "These Foolish Things." Tony's head turned toward the sound instinctively, his body responding to the music the way a plant responds to sunlight. Anna watched her son's face transform as the melody washed over him, saw the way his eyes closed and his breathing deepened, as if the song were feeding some essential part of his soul. "That's what I want to do," he said quietly, his eyes still closed. "Not copy Frank, not try to sound like him, but sing with that same kind of honesty, that same connection to the music and the words. Sing in a way that makes people feel less alone. When the song ended, the kitchen seemed too quiet, as if the absence of music had left a vacuum that their breathing couldn't fill. Anna released her son's hands and stood up, moving to the sink, where she began washing the dinner dishes with methodical precision. "If you're going to do this," she said without turning around, "you need to do it right. No half measures, no backup plans that make it easy to quit when things get difficult. And you need to remember who you are, where you come from. Don't let anyone convince you to become someone else just to sell records." Tony stood up and walked to where his mother stood at the sink, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "I won't forget, Ma. I promise." She turned in his arms, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had when he was 10 years old, and she was trying to explain why his father wouldn't be coming home anymore. Vulnerable, frightened, but determined to be strong for the people who depended on her. "Your father," she said quietly. "He used to sing to me when we were young, back in Italy. Not professionally, just for joy, for love. He had this way of making even the saddest songs sound hopeful, like no matter what we were going through, there was beauty still worth celebrating." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "You have that same gift, Anthony. That same ability to find hope in the darkness." "Then I owe it to his memory to use it," Tony said. Anna nodded, tears finally spilling over onto her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, "I think you do." Later that night, after Anna had gone to bed and the apartment had settled into the familiar rhythms of sleep, Tony sat by his bedroom window, looking out over the rooftops of Astoria toward the glittering lights of Manhattan in the distance. The city seemed to pulse with possibility and danger in equal measure, a place where dreams came true and were destroyed with equal efficiency. He pulled out a notebook, its pages worn soft from constant use, and began writing. Not songs, not yet, but thoughts, observations about the world he was preparing to enter. The music business of 1946 was rebuilding itself just like everything else in America, trying to find its footing in a world that had been fundamentally changed by war. There would be opportunities for artists who could speak to that experience, who could help people make sense of what they had lived through. But there would also be dangers. The entertainment industry had always been controlled by powerful interests. People who saw music not as art, but as product, something to be manufactured and marketed for maximum profit. Tony had heard stories from other musicians, veterans like himself, who had come back from the war hoping to make music their living, only to find themselves caught between their artistic integrity and the commercial demands of record companies, club owners, and booking agents. Some had compromised. Others had given up entirely. A few had found ways to navigate the system while staying true to themselves, but they were rare, and their paths were never easy. Tony closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the decision he had made, settling over him like a heavy coat. Tomorrow, he would start making the rounds of the clubs, auditioning for anyone who would listen, trying to find his place in an industry that might not have room for what he was offering. But tonight, in the quiet of his childhood bedroom, with the sounds of his sleeping family around him and the lights of the city beckoning in the distance, he allowed himself to dream, to imagine a stage where he could stand and sing the songs that mattered to him, where his voice could reach people who needed to hear that they weren't alone, that their struggles had meaning, that there was beauty to be found even in the darkest times. It was a dangerous dream, he knew. The kind that could break a man if he held onto it too tightly or gave up too easily. But it was his dream, born from his father's voice and his mother's strength, tempered by war and shaped by survival, and he was ready to see where it would take him. The Blue Note Cafe sat like a jewel in the rough on West 52nd Street, its neon sign casting blue shadows across the wet pavement in the early November rain. Tony stood across the street, collar turned up against the wind, watching through the rain-streaked windows as silhouettes moved inside the warm, smoky interior. This was his 15th audition in 2 months, and he could feel the familiar mixture of hope and dread settling in his stomach like a stone. The year 1947 had been a series of closed doors and polite rejections. Club owners who wanted crooners to sound exactly like Sinatra or Perry Como. Record executives who insisted that jazz phrasing was too sophisticated for mainstream audiences. Booking agents who took one look at his construction-calloused hands and Italian surname and suggested he might be happier playing the ethnic clubs in Brooklyn. But the Blue Note was different. Tony had been watching this club for weeks, slipping in during off hours to nurse a single drink and study the acoustics, the crowd, the way different singers connected with the room. The club's owner, Maurice Levy, had a reputation for being both ruthless and discerning. He could make or break a career, but he also had an ear for genuine talent when he heard it. Tonight, Levy was holding auditions for a regular weekend slot. 2 hours, Friday and Saturday nights, singing for the sophisticated crowd that gathered here to hear real music performed by real musicians. It was the kind of opportunity that could change everything. If Tony could convince Levy that his particular brand of authenticity was what the room needed. He crossed the street, dodging a taxi that seemed to emerge from the rain like a yellow ghost, and pushed through the heavy wooden door into the warmth and noise of the club. The Blue Note's interior was all dark wood and red velvet, with small round tables crowded around a stage that seemed to glow under the spotlights. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the competing fragrances of expensive perfume and cheap gin, creating an atmosphere that was both intimate and electric. A handful of other singers were already waiting, clustered around tables near the bar, their sheet music carefully organized, their stage clothes pressed and perfect. Tony recognized a few faces from other auditions, guys who had been making the rounds just as long as he had, each of them hoping that tonight would be the night their luck changed. "You, Bennett?" A gravelly voice made him turn. Maurice Levy himself stood behind the bar, a man in his mid-30s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. He was shorter than Tony had expected, stocky and solid, with the kind of presence that filled a room despite his size. "Yes, sir. Anthony Bennett." Tony had started using the shortened version of his last name for auditions, thinking it sounded less ethnic, more commercial. The compromise sat uncomfortably on his tongue every time he said it. Levy looked him up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had seen 1,000 hopefuls come through his door. "You're not dressed like the others," he observed, nodding toward Tony's simple black suit, the same one he had worn to his father's funeral 15 years ago, now carefully maintained and altered to fit his broader shoulders. "No, sir. I figured you'd want to hear what I sound like, not see how well I can dress up like someone else." A slight smile flickered across Levy's face. "Fair enough. You're up fourth. Jake Williams is setting up now." "You know Jake?" Tony shook his head. Through the crowd, he could see a tall, thin man adjusting a microphone stand, his movements economical and professional. Jake Williams had the look of someone who had been performing for years, comfortable with the stage in a way that spoke of countless nights in countless clubs. "Jake's been working the circuit for 8 years, Levy continued, pouring himself a whiskey and settling in to watch. "Good voice, reliable, knows how to work a room. But he's getting stale, you know, playing it safe. People come here for something they can't get on the radio." Tony nodded, understanding the subtext. The Blue Note's clientele was sophisticated, educated, looking for music that challenged them rather than simply entertaining them. They wanted to hear something that acknowledged the complexity of their lives, the contradictions and complications that came with being alive in post the Flamingo Hotel. Rose from the Nevada desert like a neon mirage, its pink stucco walls and palm trees defying the harsh landscape that surrounded Las Vegas in 1958. Tony Bennett stood at his dressing room window on the 3rd floor, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains as the city began its nightly transformation into a glittering oasis of sin and possibility. The desert air was dry against his face, carrying the faint scent of chlorine from the pool below and the distant sound of slot machines singing their metallic songs. His reflection in the window showed a man who had travelled far from the construction sites of Queens. At 32, Tony's face had shed its boyish softness, replaced by the angular features that photographers loved and the knowing eyes that had seen too much. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his dinner jacket pressed to perfection, but beneath the polished exterior lay a knot of unease that had been growing for weeks. Mr. Bennett. The voice belonged to Mickey Torino, a slight man with nervous eyes who served as the Flamingo's entertainment liaison. Tony had learned to read the subtle signs in men like Mickey, the way their hands trembled when they lit cigarettes, how their voices carried undertones of fear beneath forced cheerfulness. "They're ready for your sound check." Tony turned from the window, adjusting his bow tie in the mirror. "Tell me something, Mickey. In all your years working these venues, how many artists have you seen who refuse to play ball?" Mickey's face went pale, and he glanced toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst through. "Mr. Bennett, I don't think—" "It's okay," Tony said softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had calmed frightened soldiers in foxholes across Europe. "I'm not asking you to name names. I'm just wondering. What happens to singers who won't bend?" The question hung in the air between them like cigarette smoke. Mickey fidgeted with his clipboard, papers rustling in the silence. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting Tony's in the mirror. "Some of them find it harder to get bookings. Others find different careers." Tony nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind those carefully chosen words. He had been feeling the subtle pressure for months now, phone calls from his agent with fewer options, venue managers who spoke in veiled suggestions about flexibility, and the constant presence of men in expensive suits who appeared at his performances with calculating eyes. The descent to the main showroom took them through corridors lined with photographs of performers who had graced the Flamingo's stage. Tony paused before a picture of Bugsy Siegel cutting the ribbon at the hotel's opening, surrounded by smiling faces that concealed the violence that had built this empire in the sand. The message was clear. In Las Vegas, entertainment and organized crime were not separate worlds, but two sides of the same coin. The Flamingo Room was already filling with the dinner crowd, high rollers from Los Angeles, tourists from the Midwest clutching their lucky coins, and the local regulars who treated the casino like their private club. Tony had performed in venues like this dozens of times, but tonight felt different. As he adjusted the microphone and tested the sound levels, he noticed the unusual composition of the audience. 3 men in charcoal suits occupied a front table, their meals untouched as they watched his every movement. They were not there for the music. That much was obvious from their rigid postures and the way their eyes never left his face. Behind them, scattered throughout the room, Tony counted at least 6 more men who carried themselves with the particular stillness of those accustomed to violence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed across the room, "the Flamingo Hotel is proud to present Mr. Tony Bennett." The spotlight found him as the orchestra began the opening notes of "Because of You," and Tony felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with live performance. But tonight, that rush was tinged with something else, the acute awareness that he was being evaluated, measured against some invisible standard that had nothing to do with his vocal ability. As he sang, Tony's eyes swept the room, reading the faces of his audience with the skill of a performer who had learned to gauge every crowd. The tourists were enchanted, swaying gently to the familiar melody. The high rollers nodded appreciatively, recognizing quality when they heard it. But the men in the expensive suits remained motionless, their expressions unreadable behind clouds of cigar smoke. During the instrumental break, Tony caught sight of a familiar figure entering through the main doors. Sal the Fish Piscano was a name whispered in entertainment circles, a man who supposedly managed various aspects of Las Vegas booking and talent relations. Tony had never met him directly, but he recognized the face from newspaper photographs and whispered descriptions from other performers. Piscano moved through the room with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He was shorter than Tony had imagined, perhaps 5'6", with thinning hair and the soft build of someone who ate well and worked little. But there was something in his movements, a predatory grace that suggested violence was never far from the surface. The song ended to enthusiastic applause, and Tony moved into his second number, Rags to Riches. As he sang about transformation and success, he wondered if the irony was lost on his unusual audience. Here he was, singing about the American dream in a room full of men who had achieved their success through means that existed in the shadows of that same dream. Halfway through the set, during a quiet ballad, Tony noticed Piscano lean over to whisper something to the men at the front table. Whatever he said caused one of them to smile, not a pleasant expression, but the kind of smile that preceded unpleasant conversations. Tony felt his throat tighten slightly, but his voice remained steady. Years of performance had taught him to separate his emotions from his craft, to sing with pure technique, even when his heart was racing. The show continued for another hour, Tony moving through his repertoire with professional precision. He sang Blue Velvet with tender emotion, delivered Cold, Cold Heart with country-inflected phrasing, and closed with I Left My Heart in San Francisco. Though the song wouldn't be written for another few years, in this moment he performed an early arrangement that would later inspire that classic. As the final notes faded and the applause washed over him, Tony felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He delivered a flawless performance, but he sensed that the evening's true test was yet to come. His suspicions were confirmed when Mickey appeared at his elbow, his face even paler than before. "Mr. Bennett," Mickey whispered urgently, "Mr. Piscano would like a word with you, in private." Tony nodded, his stomach knotting. He had known this moment would come eventually. The moment when his principles would be directly challenged by forces that did not accept refusal easily. As he followed Mickey through the backstage corridors, Tony thought of his father, John Benedetto, who had died working construction to support his family. John had been a man of simple integrity, someone who believed that honest work was its own reward. Tony wondered what his father would say about the choice he was about to face. The private dining room was smaller than Tony had expected, furnished with the kind of understated luxury that whispered money rather than shouting it. Piscano sat alone at a round table, a plate of untouched pasta before him, and a glass of red wine in his hand. He gestured for Tony to sit, his movements economical and precise. "Mr. Bennett," Piscano said, his voice carrying the faint accent of his Brooklyn origins, "you put on quite a show tonight. The crowd loved you." "Thank you," Tony replied carefully, settling into the chair across from him. "I always try to give my best." Piscano smiled, swirling the wine in his glass. "That's what I like about you. Professional, dedicated to your craft. These are admirable qualities in any business." The emphasis on the word business was subtle but unmistakable. Tony waited, knowing that patience was often the best response in situations like this. "You know," Piscano continued, "Las Vegas is a special place. It's where dreams come true, where talented people can build careers that last a lifetime. But like any community, it works best when everyone understands their role." "I understand," Tony said, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what came next. Piscano leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes fixing on Tony's face. "Do you? Because from what I hear, you've been turning down some opportunities lately. Good opportunities. Profitable opportunities." Tony felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his voice steady. "I've been selective about my bookings, yes. I believe in maintaining certain standards." "Standards." Piscano rolled the word around like he was tasting something bitter. "Let me tell you about standards, Mr. Bennett. My standards are simple. I expect cooperation from people who work in my city. I expect them to understand that their success depends on maintaining good relationships with the right people." The threat was becoming clearer now, wrapped in the polite language of business, but unmistakably sinister. Tony thought of the stories he had heard from other performers, Careers that had suddenly stalled, bookings that had mysteriously disappeared, and in a few cases, singers who had simply vanished from the entertainment world entirely. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Tony asked, deciding that directness was his best strategy. Piscano smiled again, and this time the expression reached his eyes, though it offered no warmth. "Smart question. I'm asking for flexibility, Mr. Bennett. Sometimes we have special events, private parties for important clients. Sometimes these events require entertainment, and we like to use the best talent available. And if the entertainment conflicts with my other commitments, my recording schedule, my television appearances, then you make adjustments," Piscano replied, his tone hardening slightly. "Because the people I represent don't like to hear the word no. It makes them uncomfortable." Tony felt the weight of the moment settling around him, like a heavy coat. He understood now that this conversation was not a request. It was an ultimatum, delivered with deceptive politeness. Accept their terms, or face consequences that could end his career, or worse. "I need time to consider this," Tony said finally. Piscano's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. "Of course, take your time. But don't take too much time. These kinds of opportunities have a way of disappearing if people wait too long to appreciate them." Tony stood, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. "Thank you for the dinner invitation." "My pleasure," Piscano said, raising his wineglass in a mock toast. "I'm sure we'll have many more opportunities to talk in the future." As Tony made his way back to his dressing room, the hotel's corridors seemed longer and more maze-like than before. The cheerful sounds of the casino felt muted, as if he was hearing them through thick glass. In the space of 30 minutes, his world had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a singer navigating the entertainment industry. He was a man caught between his principles and forces that did not recognize the concept of conscience. Back in his dressing room, Tony sat heavily in the chair before his mirror and stared at his reflection. The man looking back at him appeared calm and composed, but Tony could see the tension in his own eyes, the subtle tightness around his mouth that betrayed his inner turmoil. He thought of his mother, Anna, working long hours as a seamstress to keep the family together after his father's death. He remembered the way she had looked at him when he first started singing professionally, her face glowing with pride at seeing her son escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped so many of their neighbors. How could he explain to her that success in America sometimes came with prices that could compromise everything she had taught him about right and wrong? The phone in his dressing room rang, its shrill tone cutting through his thoughts. Tony hesitated before answering, wondering if this was already the beginning of the pressure Piscano had promised. "Tony?" The voice on the other end belonged to his agent, Joe Salters, calling from New York. "How did the show go tonight?" "The show was fine," Tony replied, choosing his words carefully. "The audience seemed to enjoy it." "Good, good. Listen, I've got some potentially exciting news. There might be an opportunity for you to headline at the Copa next month. It would mean canceling those dates in Chicago, but this could be bigger for your career long term." Tony felt a chill run down his spine. Was this already beginning? Was the Copacabana booking somehow connected to his conversation with Piscano, a test to see how quickly he would abandon his existing commitments? "Joe," Tony said slowly, "who exactly is behind this Copa opportunity?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Why do you ask?" "It's coming through the usual channels. Some investors who want to showcase top talent." The carefully neutral language told Tony everything he needed to know. In the entertainment world of 1958, investors often meant the same people who had built Las Vegas from desert sand and violence. "I need to think about it," Tony said. "Can I call you back tomorrow?" "Sure, but don't wait too long. These opportunities move fast." After hanging up, Tony sat in silence, staring at his hands. The calluses from his construction work had long since faded, replaced by the soft palms of a man who made his living with his voice. But the memories of that harder life remained, along with the values his parents had instilled in him during those difficult years. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Tony opened it to find a young man he didn't recognize, perhaps 19 or 20, with nervous eyes and a cheap suit that marked him as someone struggling to make his way in the world. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Tommy Ricci. I'm a singer, well, trying to be one. I was wondering if I could ask you for some advice." Something in the young man's earnest expression reminded Tony of himself a decade earlier, full of hope and determination despite the obstacles ahead. "Come in," Tony said, stepping aside. Tommy entered hesitantly, clearly awed by being in the presence of an established performer. "I just wanted to say that your show tonight was incredible. The way you sang Because of You, it gave me chills." "Thank you," Tony said, gesturing for Tommy to sit down. "Tell me about your own singing. Where are you performing?" "Mostly small clubs downtown. The pay is terrible, but I'm trying to build a reputation, you know. My family thinks I'm crazy for trying to make it in music, but I can't imagine doing anything else." Tony studied the young man's face, seeing his own younger self reflected there. "It's not an easy business," he said quietly. "Sometimes the choices you have to make, they're not always clear-cut." "What do you mean?" Tony hesitated, wondering how much he could safely say. "There are people in this business who will offer you opportunities, but those opportunities sometimes come with strings attached. The important thing is to remember who you are and what you stand for, even when it would be easier to compromise." Tommy nodded eagerly, though Tony suspected he didn't fully understand the weight behind the words. "I just want to sing, Mr. Bennett. I want to make music that matters to people." "Hold on to that feeling," Tony said, his voice carrying an intensity that surprised them both. "Whatever happens, don't let anyone convince you to give up that dream." After Tommy left, Tony began the slow process of removing his stage makeup and changing into street clothes. Each familiar ritual felt different now, as if he was preparing for a different kind of performance, one where the stakes were higher than applause, and the audience was far more dangerous than any crowd of music lovers. As he prepared to leave the Flamingo, Tony made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He would not compromise his principles, regardless of the consequences. He would find a way to navigate these treacherous waters while maintaining his integrity, even if it meant risking everything he had worked to achieve. The desert night was cool against his skin as he walked toward his rental car, the neon lights of the strip casting surreal shadows across the parking lot. In the distance, the mountains rose like dark sentinels against the star-filled sky, reminding Tony that beyond this artificial oasis lay a vast wilderness where men could disappear without a trace. But as he drove through the empty streets toward his hotel, Tony Bennett felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of clarity about his path forward. He would sing his songs, tell his truths, and trust that somewhere in the darkness there were still people who believed that art and integrity could coexist. He had no way of knowing that his decision would soon bring him to the attention of someone whose help would prove as unexpected as it was crucial. A fellow performer who understood better than most the delicate balance between survival and principles in a world where both were constantly under threat. 3 weeks had passed since Tony's meeting with Sal Piscano, and the temperature had dropped significantly across the entertainment circuit. Not the kind of cold that came with changing seasons, but the institutional chill that settled over a performer when invisible forces began to... The February wind cut through the streets of Manhattan like a blade, carrying with it the promise of snow and the weight of decisions that could no longer be avoided. Tony Bennett stood at the window of his apartment on the Upper West Side, watching pedestrians below lean into the bitter gusts, their coats pulled tight against the cold. The city moved with its usual relentless energy, but tonight something felt different. Charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. 3 weeks had passed since the meeting at the Copacabana, and the silence from Giancana's people had been more unnerving than any direct threat. Tony knew enough about how these things worked to understand that quiet often preceded violence. The entertainment world was a small one, and word traveled fast. He'd heard whispers, cancelled bookings, venues suddenly unavailable, promoters who wouldn't return his manager's calls. The invisible hand of organized crime was slowly but surely tightening around his career. Patricia emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, her face etched with concern. She'd been trying to maintain normalcy, but Tony could see the strain in her eyes, the way she startled at unexpected sounds, how she double-checked the locks each night. "Jimmy called again," she said softly, setting his cup on the table beside the window. "He says the Sands pulled out of the March booking, said they had scheduling conflicts." Her voice carried the weight of unspoken knowledge. They both knew what this really meant. Tony took the coffee, feeling its warmth against his palms, but it did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled in his bones. "How many does that make?" 7 venues in 3 weeks. Patricia sat beside him, her hand finding his. "Tony, maybe it's time to consider—" "No." His voice was firm, but not harsh. He'd had this conversation with himself 100 times, weighing principles against pragmatism, integrity against survival. "I won't sing their songs. I won't be their puppet. If that means starting over, then that's what we'll do." The phone rang, sharp and insistent in the quiet apartment. They both froze, as they had learned to do whenever the phone rang after dark. Tony rose slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, and lifted the receiver. "Hello? Tony? It's Dean." The familiar voice, smooth as aged whiskey, sent a wave of relief through him. Dean Martin had been one of the few friends in the industry who hadn't distanced himself as the pressure mounted. Their friendship had grown over the years through mutual respect and shared Italian heritage, though they moved in very different circles. "Dean, good to hear from you." Tony sank into his chair, nodding reassuringly to Patricia. "What's on your mind? We need to talk, in person, tonight." Dean's voice carried an urgency that was uncharacteristic of his usual laid-back demeanor. "Can you meet me at Patsy's in an hour?" Tony glanced at Patricia, who had moved closer, her brow furrowed with concern. Patsy's was a small Italian restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place where conversations could be held in privacy, where the owner knew to give certain customers space. "Is everything all right? Just be there, Tony. And—" Dean paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Come alone." The line went dead, leaving Tony staring at the receiver. Patricia's hand tightened on his shoulder. What did he want? "To meet. Tonight." Tony stood, already reaching for his coat. "Something's happening, Pat. I can hear it in his voice. Then I'm coming with you." "No." Tony turned to face her, his hands gentle but firm on her shoulders. "Dean said to come alone. If he's calling this meeting, it's for a reason. These people, they have their ways of doing things, their codes. I need to respect that." Patricia's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "I'm scared, Tony. These past weeks, the phone calls, the threats. I keep thinking about what happened to that comedian in Chicago last month. They found him in the river." Tony pulled her close, feeling the weight of her fear against his chest. The comedian she mentioned had been making jokes about the wrong people, jokes that weren't appreciated by men who settled disagreements with violence rather than words. The official cause of death was drowning, but everyone knew better. "That won't happen to us," he whispered into her hair. "I won't let it." But even as he spoke the words, Tony wondered if they were promises he could keep. An hour later, Tony pushed through the heavy wooden door of Patsy's restaurant, the warmth and aroma of garlic and oregano enveloping him like an embrace. The place was nearly empty, unusual for a Friday night, but not surprising given the weather. Patsy himself, a stout man with knowing eyes, nodded toward a corner booth where Dean Martin sat alone, his signature martini untouched on the table. Dean looked up as Tony approached, and for a moment his carefully cultivated mask of casual confidence slipped, revealing something harder, more serious beneath. "Thanks for coming," Dean said, gesturing for Tony to sit. His usual easy smile was nowhere to be seen. "You sounded like it was urgent." Tony slid into the booth, noting how Dean had positioned himself to watch both the entrance and the kitchen door, a survival instinct that spoke of deeper knowledge than most people possessed. Patsy appeared with a glass of wine for Tony, set it down without a word, and disappeared back into the kitchen. The message was clear. They wouldn't be disturbed. Dean leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Tony, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting. Can you do that?" Tony nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settling around them like fog. "I know what's been happening to you. The cancelled bookings, the pressure. I know because I've been hearing things that made me realize you're in more danger than you know." Dean's fingers drummed nervously on the table, a tell that revealed just how serious this conversation was. "Sam Giancana isn't just unhappy with your refusal to cooperate. He's decided you're a problem that needs to be solved." The words hit Tony like ice water. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his mouth go dry. "How do you know this?" "Because I was asked to deliver a message to you. Tonight. At the Sands." Dean's eyes met Tony's directly. "They want you in Las Vegas tomorrow night. One last conversation. One final opportunity to reconsider your position." Tony felt the world tilt slightly. "And if I refuse?" Dean's silence was answer enough. "But you're here instead of Vegas," Tony said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "Why?" "Because I've been where you are, Tony. Not exactly the same, but close enough." Dean took a long sip of his martini, his hand remarkably steady despite the gravity of their conversation. "When Frank and I started the Rat Pack, we thought we were just entertainers who happened to be friends. But in Vegas, in Miami, in Chicago, everywhere we performed, there were expectations, compromises, little favors that led to bigger ones." Tony leaned closer, sensing that Dean was about to reveal something significant. "I made my peace with it, found ways to navigate the waters without drowning. But you're different, Tony. You've got something I lost along the way, principles that you won't compromise, even when it costs you everything." Dean's voice carried a note of both admiration and regret. "The problem is that kind of integrity makes certain people nervous. It makes them worry that you might talk, might become a liability. I would never. I know that. You know that. But they don't know that. And in their world, uncertainty is eliminated through very permanent means." The restaurant seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very walls were listening. Tony could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat beginning to form despite the cool evening. "So, what happens now?" Tony asked. "Do I run, leave the country, change my name and disappear?" Dean shook his head slowly. "Running makes you look guilty, and guilty men get hunted. No, there's only one way out of this that doesn't end with you in the ground or at the bottom of the Hudson River, which is, you let me handle it." Tony stared at his friend, searching his face for meaning. "What does that mean exactly?" Dean glanced around the restaurant once more, then leaned even closer. "It means you trust me to have a conversation with the right people. It means you stay away from Vegas, stay away from any venue where you might accidentally cross paths with Giancana's crew, and you let me use whatever influence I have to convince them that you're not worth the trouble. And why would you do this for me? What's in it for you?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Dean's carefully constructed persona cracked completely, revealing a man who carried his own burdens, his own regrets. "Because 20 years ago, when I was Anthony Crocetti, struggling to make it out of Steubenville, someone gave me a chance. Someone saw something in me worth saving." Dean's voice carried the weight of old pain, old choices. "Maybe I can't undo the compromises I made along the way, but I can make sure you don't have to make them." Tony felt something shift inside him, gratitude mixed with fear, hope tempered by the knowledge of what Dean was risking for him. In the entertainment world, crossing the wrong people could end careers or lives with equal efficiency. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay invisible for a few weeks. Cancel any public appearances. Don't talk to reporters. Don't make any statements about Vegas or the mob, or anything that might be construed as provocative." Dean's instructions carried the weight of experience. "Can you do that?" Tony nodded, though the thought of hiding, of letting fear dictate his actions, went against every instinct he possessed. "There's something else," Dean continued. This conversation never happened. If anyone asks, you and I haven't spoken in months. You don't know anything about Vegas, about messages, about meetings. You're just a singer who's been having booking difficulties. Understood? Understood. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken dangers settling between them like sediment. Finally, Dean reached across the table and clasped Tony's shoulder. I need you to believe me when I say this. You're going to survive this. You're going to keep singing, keep making music on your own terms. But first, you have to trust me to do what needs to be done. Tony looked into his friend's eyes and saw something he hadn't expected: certainty. Dean Martin, the man who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of entertainment and organized crime, was absolutely convinced he could protect Tony Bennett. The question was whether Tony was willing to let him try. I trust you, Tony said quietly. Dean smiled then, the first genuine smile Tony had seen from him all evening. Good. Now finish your wine and go home to Patricia. Kiss her, tell her you love her, and try to get some sleep. Tomorrow, everything changes. As Tony walked back through the cold Manhattan streets, his mind raced with questions and possibilities. He thought about the young Italian immigrant boy who had dreamed of nothing more than singing his way out of poverty, and the man he had become. Successful, but now threatened, principled, but possibly naive. The snow had begun to fall, soft flakes catching the glow of streetlights and transforming the harsh urban landscape into something almost beautiful. Tony pulled his coat tighter and quickened his pace, eager to get home to Patricia, to hold her close and pretend for one more night that their world wasn't balanced on the edge of a knife. Behind him, his footprints in the snow marked the path of a man walking toward an uncertain future, trusting in the word of a friend who moved in shadows Tony couldn't see, who fought battles Tony couldn't understand, who was about to risk everything to save a voice that refused to be silenced. The storm was gathering, and tomorrow would bring the reckoning that had been building for months. But tonight, Tony Bennett was still alive, still free, still able to choose between principle and survival. And in a small Italian restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, Dean Martin finished his martini and made a phone call that would change everything. The private jet touched down at McCarran Airport just after midnight, its engines whining to a stop on the tarmac, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. Dean Martin descended the stairs with the casual confidence that had become his trademark. His fedora tilted at precisely the right angle, his suit immaculate despite the long flight from New York. To any observer, he looked like a man arriving for just another Vegas gig, relaxed, untroubled, ready to charm another audience. But beneath the carefully cultivated facade, Dean's mind was working with the precision of a chess master. Every move from this point forward would be calculated, every word chosen with surgical care. One mistake, one misread of the room's dynamics, and Tony Bennett would be dead within the week. A black Cadillac waited at the bottom of the stairs, its engine running, exhaust visible in the cool desert air. Vincent the Fish Torino sat behind the wheel, his thick fingers drumming against the steering wheel in a rhythm that suggested barely contained violence. In the passenger seat, Carlo Benedetti, no relation to Tony, despite the name, turned to watch Dean's approach with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. "Dino," Vincent called through the open window, using Dean's stage nickname with the familiarity of old acquaintance. "You're late. Traffic in New York," Dean replied smoothly, sliding into the back seat. "You know how it is." The car pulled away from the airport, heading toward the neon glow of the Strip. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was charged with unspoken tensions. These men had worked together before, had shared profits and secrets and the occasional necessary violence, but tonight felt different, heavier, more consequential. "Mr. Giancana's waiting at the Desert Inn," Carlo said without turning around. "He's not happy about flying out here on short notice." Dean nodded, understanding the subtext. Sam Giancana didn't make unscheduled trips to Las Vegas unless something required his personal attention. The fact that he was here now meant that the Tony Bennett situation had escalated beyond what Dean had hoped. "How's his mood?" Dean asked, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. Vincent laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "You know Momo. When is he ever in a good mood?" They drove in silence through the glittering heart of Las Vegas, past the Flamingo where Tony had first encountered Torino's crew, past the sands where Dean himself had performed countless times, past the venues that represented both the glamour and the danger of this desert oasis. The city never slept, and even at this hour, tourists and locals moved through the streets, chasing dreams or running from nightmares. The Desert Inn rose before them like a modernist cathedral, its clean lines and understated elegance masking the darker business conducted in its private rooms. Dean had been here many times before, but tonight the familiar building felt ominous, a place where careers and lives could be ended with a word. They entered through a side entrance, avoiding the main lobby where Dean might be recognized. The corridors were carpeted in deep burgundy, the walls lined with paintings that probably cost more than most people made in a year. It was the kind of place that whispered of power and money, where men in expensive suits made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Sam Giancana was waiting in a suite on the top floor, standing at the windows that overlooked the strip. Even from behind, he cut an imposing figure, not particularly tall, but with the kind of compact build that suggested coiled violence. His hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, his suit pressed to military precision. "Dino," he said without turning around. "Come in. Close the door." Dean entered the suite, noting the other men present. Bodyguards mostly, but also Joey the Pipe Giuliano, Giancana's chief enforcer, a man whose reputation for creative violence preceded him wherever he went. This was serious, then. Giancana didn't bring Joey to casual meetings. "You wanted to see me, Momo?" Dean kept his voice level, respectful but not servile. In this world, showing too much deference could be as dangerous as showing too little. Giancana finally turned, his dark eyes fixing on Dean with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "I did. We have a problem, you and I. A problem named Anthony Benedetto." Dean said nothing, waiting. In negotiations like this, the first person to speak often lost the advantage. "This singer of yours," Giancana continued, moving away from the window to pour himself a glass of whiskey from a crystal decanter. "He seems to think he's above the normal courtesies of our business arrangement. Tony's a good kid, Momo. Maybe a little stubborn, but—" "Stubborn?" Giancana's voice cracked like a whip. He was offered a simple accommodation. Sing a few songs, appear at a few venues, show some respect for the people who made his success possible. Instead, he insults my representatives, refuses reasonable requests, and makes speeches about artistic integrity. Dean could feel the temperature in the room dropping. Joey Giuliano shifted slightly, a movement that spoke of readiness, of potential action. The other bodyguards remained statue still, but Dean could sense their attention focused on him like laser beams. "Sam, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Tony didn't mean to..." "Didn't mean to what?" "Didn't mean to tell Vincent here that he wouldn't sing mob songs in his clubs. Didn't mean to suggest that our business practices were beneath his moral standards." Giancana's voice rose with each word, his carefully controlled facade beginning to crack. "Or maybe he didn't mean to tell a reporter last month that Las Vegas was controlled by unsavory elements?" Dean felt his heart skip a beat. He hadn't known about the reporter comment, and judging by Giancana's reaction, it had been taken very seriously indeed. "I understand your concern. Do you?" Giancana set his whiskey glass down with force that sent liquid splashing across the polished wood surface. "Because from where I sit, it looks like your friend thinks he can bite the hand that feeds him and walk away unscathed." This was the moment Dean had been preparing for. The crucial point where everything would either be resolved or spiral into violence. He took a breath, centering himself, calling upon years of experience in reading rooms, understanding power dynamics, navigating the treacherous waters of entertainment and crime. Sam, may I speak frankly? Giancana gestured for him to continue, but his expression remained dangerous. Tony Bennett is a problem, you're right, but he's the wrong kind of problem. Dean moved closer, his voice dropping to a conversational level that forced everyone in the room to lean in slightly. You want to make an example of him? Show other entertainers what happens when they don't show